So for part 2 of this video, let's play What Has Changed? Now by now, most of you will probably have noted that this hat was on my head in the first part of this video series, first video. Do you notice anything else that has changed? About what you're seeing in this video? Well, some of you who are more astute may have noticed that behind me, we now have a whiteboard, or a whiteboard, depending upon where you're from, which you can probably just dimly make out has the word focus written on it. And it wasn't there before. Instead, a bunch of lovely child's art was up there, much like over there. So why would I start with such irrelevant sounding questions as what has changed since you last tuned in? And for me, it's the same day because I actually went ahead and plugged on and making the same or the next in the series today. Well, what I want to talk about in this video is what I call coming to your senses. I'm not the first to call it that. Jon Kabat-Zinn's called it that too. That mindfulness practice and act and related stuff that I do and suggest people do has to do with coming back to your senses, your 5 senses, as a very important source of information that often gets overlooked. We talked in the last video about how animals can often track things better than we can, and that actually is a fairly technical term, tracking. For those of you who are watching who might be therapists, check out my relational frame theory series in which I may or may not cover tracking versus rule-governed behavior. I don't remember anymore. But anyhow, tracking is what the animal is doing. In the example that I gave, one of the examples I gave in the last video was touching a hot stove and then not touching it again because it burned your paw, if you're an animal, and how they track stuff like that very, very well. We don't necessarily, and that is both to our detriment and to our benefit in ways that should become clear by the end of this video series. So I asked you what changed to give you a little bit of an experience of challenging yourself to ask what is your experience, at risk of being circular. So in other words, I offered you an opportunity to check with your experience against your memory of what there was before. Now, of course, there's a lot going on here. We're comparing one thing to another by memory. But that turns out to be pretty important when it comes to tracking stuff better, when it comes to responding more from experience and less from verbal rules, especially where verbal rules are not working. Rules such as in the example I drew in the last video, rules like use really big words, show off how smart you are, and all sorts of affection and love and positive attention will come your way, which was, I think I could hazard a guess that that would be a tacit belief of mine from childhood that I learned through what originally was the experience, the direct experience of using big words and showing off that I was bright, clever academically, and getting a lot of positive attention, and then going on to another setting, which would be grade school, where that did not work with other people who were my peers, where that absolutely did not work, but I was very, very slow to change my behavior. I touched that hot stove and got burned and decided something must be wrong with the stove. So the conclusion of the last video was, in yet another metaphorical example, that a rat will run a maze for the cheese at the end of the maze, but will stop running the maze after a number of times without finding cheese at the end. But a human, some used to say, would run the maze over and over again after there no longer has been cheese forthcoming at the end of the maze saying, "Where's my effing cheese?" So what's happening there? The human has abstracted a verbal rule, actually a behavior of stating to themselves, there will be or should be cheese at the end of the maze when I find the middle of the maze, when I run the whole maze. That's not what animals appear to do. Animals appear to just do something and either get rewarded for it, not rewarded for it, or actively punished, hurt in some way for it, and they adjust their behavior accordingly, rather predictably and faithfully under almost all circumstances. There are many, many circumstances in which humans do not adjust behavior in response to feedback from the world. Even feedback that's quite painful, let's say, or even feedback that's quite pleasurable or quite enjoyable, or even feedback that tells them that they're moving in exactly the direction they intend to in life. Humans will very often follow the rules that have formed in their heads, which is why the technical term is rumishuga, which in Yiddish means we're nuts. But are we so nuts? Let's look at this. I'm saying come back to your senses, but do you really want to entirely come back to your senses? Do you want to, like an animal, follow whatever feels good, and that means it's good, and whatever feels bad, that means it's bad? Gee, I'm not sure that that's the case. If that were the case, you might say, I would never do anything uncomfortable. So don't exercise. I generally follow that adage. It's uncomfortable. Just don't do it, because it's uncomfortable. I'm phrasing these in terms of rules, but basically that your behavior would follow whatever's uncomfortable, don't do it. Whatever's comfortable, do that. So we'd all stop exercising because it tends to be uncomfortable, and we'd all start doing heroin, let's say, cocaine and heroin, alternating shots of cocaine and heroin, highballing, they used to call it in New York City, apparently is very, very pleasurable. I promise you I wouldn't know about that particular experience. This is not generally advice that we give one another. Get yourself addicted to hard drugs because they're very pleasurable. We generally don't tell one another, listen, if it's difficult to complete a degree, what have you, be it associate, bachelor's, master's, doctorate, doesn't matter. If it gets hard, just stop, just quit. So clearly, I'm not going to advise you to do whatever feels good and not do whatever feels uncomfortable. So then what do I mean by come to your senses? Why is coming to one's senses a good thing? Why should one care whether one can notice and track accurately, in this case, irrelevant things like whether there's a new background behind me or part of my background is different, or whether I used to be wearing a hat even, which was more obvious, though most of you, I'm sure, noticed that, especially since I pointed it out in the last video. And I see once again that I'm rattling on and I have a lot more to say than I thought. So if you still have faith that this is going somewhere useful, hopefully you will watch the third video, which I'll make maybe today, maybe later.